Join us for the Criterion Institute podcast as Joy Anderson, a global thought leader in business and social change, leads us through a series of discussions, interviews, frameworks, rants, and reframes that will help you better understand how to use finance as a tool for transformative systems change.
I am Joy Anderson, and this is the Criterion Institute podcast. I've been thinking lately about narratives, not because they're new, but they seem to be showing up more and more in conversations about finance, ownership, economic change, social impact. I had a wonderful conversation with Joanna Cea. She's founded Valiente Capital Design, and she co-leads the Beloved Economies Collaborative for Narrative Infrastructure. What a title. What struck me in that conversation was the reminder that narratives are not just stories we tell. They shape what people believe is possible, what feels normal, what kinds of change they can imagine. And that matters in finance. Finance often presents itself as technical. We talk about structures, products, strategies, markets, but underneath those decisions are stories about value, ownership, expertise, risk, and who gets to participate. Which brings me to another word that's been showing up a lot and has been for a while in parts of finance that are trying to create social or environmental good: local. It's a word used, heard constantly. The more I listen, though, to people talk about local, the more I'm convinced that people are often telling very different stories with the same word. So in this episode, I want to bring those two conversations together. First, a conversation with Joanna about narratives and how they shape change and why shifting them requires more than better messaging. Then a deeper exploration of what we actually mean when we talk about local in finance and why the stories attached to that word matter more than we might think. Because before we design new solutions, it's worth asking what stories are already shaping the way we see the world. Enjoy. So, hey, Joanna, so cool to talk to you. And I love any opportunity to talk to people about narratives and narrative theory and narrative structure and how narratives create change. But you were just in Newark, so we should probably start with Newark. I'm a Jersey girl. So in the
awesome.
end,
Okay.
yeah. Anyway, just gotta love anybody who shows up in Jersey and doesn't crack jokes first. But so what were you doing? You were like at a highfalutin thing in Jersey.
Yes,
though.
it was a very highfalutin thing. So Aspen Institute held the first summit conference that they're doing that's called Aspen Ideas Economy. And Aspen Institute, I guess, has various things they do under the Aspen Ideas approach. And this was the first one they have held on the topic of economy. And I was there in particular because there was a whole subset of sessions there around ownership and how do we expand worker ownership of businesses, family ownership of homes, collective community ownership of homes and assets. And I also learned about some really cool work of how do we expand kind of ownership of the public markets and create more pathways for everyday folks to be part of the stock market in a way that builds intergenerational wealth. So is it problematic to say I was pleasantly surprised by how cool the conference was? But I was pleasantly surprised, and I saw some old friends I didn't expect, made lots of new connects, and I learned a lot about Newark. And it was very intentional that they held it in Newark, and they had some very cool place-based happenings the first day, given Newark's history as one of the earliest industrial centers, and also really cool stuff happening at the community level currently.
And so the ownership economy, it's an interesting, I think there's a new report coming out soon. I'm actually at a breakfast for the launch of this new report on the ownership economy, and I remember being interviewed about this a couple of months ago, or maybe 6 months ago or so now, about sort of really thinking about how do you build a field around a new set of ideas, right? So the take the ownership economy stuff, which has been called so many different things, assets and blah, and we can think about all the different names that are basically saying, shifting wealth. I mean, just so many different phrases. It's interesting that a lot of folks have landed on ownership, and that's kind of a narrative play, right? It's sort of what is the word that will shift the imagination in the way that you intend. And so you were there because of the Beloved Economy stuff you do, right?
Exactly. Yep. And I think it's interesting too, the way that ownership as a narrative frame is being picked up in bipartisan ways. There's interesting resonance with that on various parts of the aisle.
I will say, I'm going to name, I think there's some interesting pieces. What was it, 15 years ago? We also used entrepreneurship as something that was bipartisan and universally. And that had, I think it's an interesting shift because entrepreneurship had certain characteristics where all of a sudden everybody needed to be an entrepreneur to be valid. And there were a lot of unintended consequences from that pretty significant narrative shift where it was all about social entrepreneurs and you weren't creating change if you weren't an entrepreneur, which before had really meant something different. So again, taking a word like ownership and playing with that, right? Like the thing that I find interesting about narrative, and this is maybe because I'm a historian, right? So for sort of being able to situate things in the context in which the language emerges and then how the language changes and maybe gets appropriated by like all those different shifts that happen around how we tell stories about who we are in the world. And so I've been bringing, I think from the beginning, I've been bringing that into the work that Criterion's been doing about sort of what's the way that all these different ways that we create change and thinking about how we shift narratives as a way of creating change is more resonant. I think it's become more popular in sort of the overall social movement space. It's newer in the impact investing, innovative finance space to think about narratives because we don't think we're talking about language, we're talking about money. Well, of course, how you talk about money is the narrative piece.
Right.
So why do you think narratives are important in all this? There's like some super long name to your Beloved Economies piece that plays out this narrative stuff. What's the long name and why that title?
I'll tell you about the name and the overall approach of that joint effort in the kind of inclusive economy space. And then I'll also speak to why I think narratives, I get particularly excited for its role in enabling scaling new forms of investment. And I think our sector is one in which narrative can move and shift quickly and make a huge difference when it does. So I am honored to be co-leading the long-named Beloved Economies Collaborative for Narrative Infrastructure, affectionately called by its members the Narrative Collab. And the reason Beloved Economies is in the name is that is a research, advocacy, narrative content creation effort that I've been a part of for about a decade. And we ran a time-bound campaign from 2020 through 2023 around lifting up stories and examples of how transforming how we work, including how we fund, is a lever of macroeconomic change. Often we think like if a team is doing some cool thing where they're working differently or sharing power differently or doing things differently with time or whatever, it can feel kind of like a navel gazing, very inner focused effort of that team. But what our research looked at over 7 years is when enterprises writ large, huge variety from like hospital departments to tech startups to nonprofits to youth groups to municipal city agencies. If a team or enterprise really intentionally departs from business as usual in how they operate, we looked specifically at ways rooted in sharing power. And then if they are successful, those stories and examples of their success become an important driver of change. They have ripple effects. They change what can get on the table as policy possibilities. They change norms in their sectors. They spark trends kind of locally, geographically. And it turns out there's a whole body of sociological and other research on this that, yes, you essentially need what Adrienne Marie Brown would call fractals.
Right.
You need these
Right.
fractals of what else is possible. And if we're smart and strategic about how we share those stories and how we link them with narrative work, it can be a really accelerating force for change. So the Beloved Economies work initially did a ton of qualitative research of stories like that. And then we also did narrative research on a shoestring, the best we could at the time, mid pandemic and everything, with quite diverse audiences in the US. The seed we planted with that initial research was, hey, you know what? If you talk about the economy, economic, anything, really anything with the word economy, pretty much everybody glazes over, feels like this has nothing to do with me. I can't change this. I, I'm just overwhelmed, and they tune out. If you talk about work
Wow.
and what is broken with how we work, what else is possible for how we work, what are amazing examples of folks working in different ways that you've never heard of, that it's a pretty wide doorway for people to go through and start asking some profound questions about how the economy could and should be different. So we really just scratched the surface of that. And then this collaborative was seeded in 2023 when Full Spectrum Capital at Movement Strategy Center said, hey, that's something we want to dive deeper into. And specifically, this is a long answer, but just to get into kind of our theoretical approach to narrative change is Full Spectrum and the group of organizations who ended up forming this collaborative together, were 15, said narrative is a team sport. But it has to be collaborative. The way that funding so often happens on the progressive side is narrative work is constrained to organizational containers, and often smaller than that, to little time-bound campaigns within an organization. Sorry, not little, they could be big, but they're still time-bound.
And single message often.
This is a very broad... Exactly.
Yeah. And not a sustained like social change play, but let's go get this word out there and see if we can get people to vote differently on this issue.
And just, this is a big generalization, but there's a lot of ways the far right has and does invest in narrative as a team sport. And the kind of collaborative, inter-organizational weaving and organizing. I mean, so much is old-fashioned organizing, and it's a long play. This is a long game. So the collaborative is a pilot we designed to explore what that can look like for a kind of single issue area on the progressive front.
The work versus economics is interesting. As you move into the investment space, work versus economics isn't, I mean, I often think about finance versus economics, and people don't glaze over. They actually put their head in a meat grinder to get away from it. Like there's just there's like a running scared.
Right.
But I find that I also find it's really challenging when we talk about money. And one of the narrative shifts that we've worked on over years was to think not about money, but about relationships, because money is just a thing that travels. And if you reframe from talking about money as the cash that's traveling within a relationship to talking about the relationship, you can get clearer about the terms of the money. So this was a big thing we've done in our work with churches, actually, as we think about how churches can be involved in thinking about the economy and finance. Money was a framing that this wasn't helpful, because it just kind of, I don't want to talk about money. I don't want to talk about, there's people who just say over and over again, I don't want to talk about money. But if we said what this is a relationship, and it's about the exchange and the terms of that relationship and the power dynamics in the relationship, and that then creates a different interest level, sense of responsibility, because I feel responsible for relationships in a way that I don't feel responsible for money. But it's a similar framing, but I'm wondering, in your move from economy to work, what are you doing to get to, do you have a magic word that helps with people thinking about investments and finance? Is that the ownership piece that's emerging?
I don't think we've necessarily cracked that yet, but internally we'll say how we work, including how we fund.
Okay.
And I also think there's an interesting thing, which again, we haven't really explicitly unpacked, but treating people who work in finance and investment in philanthropy as workers.
Ooh.
Who can also reimagine how they work.
Ooh.
Yes.
Oh, I like
And
that.
There's interesting, not our own narrative, but that other folks have shared around, we all know the way that we are funded, the terms and culture and pace and expectations of finance play an outsized role in setting the container and the rules of the game for how our whole economy works.
Interesting.
So I think we often talk about, it's important for everyone to reimagine how we work. When you work in finance, you may have a particularly potent ripple effect if you reimagine the terms and culture and pace of how you work.
So one of our tools that just I really, that's kind of got my brain thinking, because I think one of the things that creates an abstraction, right, is to think about systems of finance as opposed to the day-to-day processes, structures, analysis that people do in finance. And one of our in Criterion's toolkit, we have these little cards that we put in a box, and on one of the outside packets of the set of cards about processes it says, what is it that these people do all day? Right. And it's thinking about the kind of Richard Scarry, like if you could take finance and make it a Richard Scarry book, maybe people would just get that this is just a bunch of workers doing different activities within a set of processes and structures and systems. And it would kind of get us out of, if we could do a Richard Scarry book on finance, I think that would really be helpful.
I agree.
That's cool.
Is someone working on that?
Yeah, I don't know. We need a really clever
any
artist.
Richard Scarry prodigies out there? Yeah.
So in this, what is the strategy? I mean, writing a children's book is then the outgrowth of a narrative strategy, because I think that's the piece that's the piece that's really hard for me. And our primary goal at Criterion around narrative shifts is around the field that we have the most influence on, of the field of gender lens investing, and probably innovative finance more broadly, but particularly in gender lens investing, we have this very specific narrative goal to shift from a conversation only about identity. And it's not that identity is not important, but we seem to only talk about identity and not talk about power. And so for years, we've been thinking about slogans like fix the capital, not the company, and all of these different pieces that sort of move from saying the problem is women entrepreneurs, blah, 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 and fill in a long series of things that are about being women, to say it's a structural problem. There's power dynamics at play, and changing who's in power doesn't actually change the power dynamics. It could. It's possible, but it isn't guaranteed. And there's a whole bunch of people who just end up in structures that don't work for them, right? So you could fund a ton of women entrepreneurs and you can harm them by giving them bad capital. So we need to think about the power dynamics in how the capital is deployed, not just access. But I think the challenge we've always had, and this is where I'd love for you to wax eloquent for a second, is what are those strategies? Like, we primarily use a strategy of thinking about reframes. How do we introduce sort of reframes that work? Shift the capital, not the company. Fix the capital, not the company, as a reframe that gets people where they are now to say, oh, wow, okay, I thought I was fixing companies, but you want me to fix capital. What would that mean? And a way that kind of catches what they think they're doing and gives them a different set of possibilities, which I think is the core of a lot of narrative shift, is the narratives that we operate in constrain what we see as possible. I mean, that's the damaging part of narratives, right? That we've told a story to ourselves that this is, to your point before, what work is. we've told a story to ourselves of this is what people do in finance. Those finance people in their Richard Scarry book, we think they just are crushing gerbils every day because they hate humanity. But there's actually a lot of people who work in finance who aren't actually day to day trying to destroy humanity. They're really just trying to do a job. Anyway, that was a lot of wandering about. But what do you do to change narratives?
Such a good question, Joy. And I'll say, just in case it's helpful for folks to, what is the difference of a narrative versus a story or a communication strategy? And I think probably a lot of folks are clear, but narratives are those underlying stories that we collectively tell ourselves about why our world is as it is, what's good and what are we supposed to be striving for, what's bad and what we shouldn't do, and kind of what's possible. And so shifting those underlying stories is really challenging. And that's what narrative power and shift is about.
Narratives are also about what's collective in the story, not just what's held individually. It's not I could have a personal narrative, but what we're really talking about is cultural narratives that shape what more than one person sees as possible. Do I have that right?
Yes, that's very well said, Joy. I feel like narratives are the underlying stories we collectively tell ourselves as a society, as subsets of the society, about what our world is, why it works the way it is, what's possible, what's good, what should we be striving for, etc. And it's hard to distinguish them because they're kind of the water we're swimming in.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of your question on how do we shift narratives, there's lots of different theories about that. And I should say too, a number of my colleagues, including my co-founder, Jess Remington, come from a longer and more formal narrative training background. And I know that the way you shift those underlying stories is around tapping into values that people have. It's hard to get people to activate or feel a value they don't already have, right? But can we tap into a value they have and kind of attach a new underlying story to it, or challenge the underlying story they do have while still building on values that they feel deeply and that they hold?
Diane, for an example in that, can you just play out a quick example?
So a lot of our collaborative is focused on the US context. A lot of people in the US believe in opportunity. We should all, there should be equal opportunity to pursue the American dream. And you can have that value coming from a variety of political stances, right? I believe in opportunity. You should be able to, pull yourself up and pursue your dreams and make it happen.
But I also could say I believe in opportunity. You people should not be. Another way to believe in opportunity is to say there shouldn't be actively people keeping me from opportunities that, whether or not I'm going to say I deserve them, they should at least be open to me, right? So there's a kind of, you could have the bootstrap version, or you could have a more structural inequity version of it.
Remove the structural barriers version, totally. And so could we, within that, help shift, someone's understanding of, say, something fundamental about business or investment, or to reframe something they've always thought of was fair, or this is just the way it is, or it should be actually, to really make that value possible, this is how X thing needs to shift.
So how banking structures work within local banks that may have practices that don't align, that sort of thinking differently about. I remember one example that sort of people would always think, well, why don't they just go into the local branch? Well, okay, just understanding who feels welcome in different places and creating a story that says, if you're not somebody who feels welcome in a bank, then the strategy that says just have them go to a bank is never going to work, right? So that's sort of, I don't know if that's a narrative shift or not, but it sort of gets to what are therefore all the other things I think about.
Yes. And I think an example a lot of folks may be familiar with, and a narrative effort that was well funded over many, many years,
Right.
was the fight for marriage equality and LGBTQ rights. And there were very studied strategic decisions to use the framework of marriage equality, even talking about marriage, and to use the rallying call of love is love, because that was able to tap into core values people held and expand the base of folks who were allies and ready to be like, of course, this is common sense.
Taking it one level down. So that's the approach, right? At some point, you're trying to identify by taking a value and figuring out ways that you can shift the stories and actions and stuff that people attach to that to be new possibilities. I sometimes wonder though, and maybe this is the crux of it all, is, or I feel like it's the crux many days, but what do I actually do on Tuesday? Back to your work thing that we started with. Somebody who's going to do day-to-day work on narrative, or let's say, I decide tomorrow I'm going to go try to fix a narrative. It took me a long time to actually figure out what to do on Tuesday, let
Mm-hmm.
alone how to put together a grant proposal that could articulate that we could shift narratives. I don't think I've done that
Right.
ever. I think we shift narratives as an outgrowth of work that people are funding us to do something else.
Totally.
So how do we make it a tactic?
Mm-hmm. I can tell you the approach that our collaborative is taking, and it also was hard for us to figure out, how are we going to do that starting Tuesday. So we did a really intentional kind of co-design process with the member organizations involved. And I'll say the starting challenge we began with is, as one colleague said, the inclusive economies movement, or next economies movement, or solidarity, whatever you call it. By the way, that's part of the problem. We don't have any
Right.
aligned.
Oh my gosh.
No, that movement is the most successful movement that no one's ever heard of. And what does she mean by that? So many of the inclusive economies solutions, whether it's worker ownership, different ways of doing UBI, like all kinds of concrete things you can do, and how you structure workplaces, funds, policies, tax stuff. It's proven beyond a doubt at this. It's not a data problem. It's not a proof point problem. It's a marketing and uptake problem. And a number of the organizations that are part of this collaborative have and offer solutions and services that are relevant for pain points we're seeing a lot right now in the economy, but few folks find them, because the ways we're talking about our work is like so stuck in our own wonky echo chambers. And so there was that challenge, and we're like, this is not unique to any one of our organizations. This is, I would argue, a movement-wide limitation. None of us are going to solve that on our own. So what does it look like to do a pilot to explore solutions to this jointly? And we really leaned into the phrase and framing of narrative infrastructure. So what does that mean for us? I'll just say what we're doing and then come back to what that means for us. What are we doing? We're basically doing three things. We're doing research, we're doing bold actions, and we're doing sharing out learnings. So we are doing a couple different kinds of research. One, we are connecting with about 100 groups, carefully chosen sample across inclusive economies work writ large in the US, including a lot of folks doing alternative ways of funding and investment, and almost doing like a narrative audit conversation with them. What's working for you in the story? Like, how have you seen, what are some of the stories that have resonated most? What's not working? Zooming out and looking nationwide, what are the narratives you see that are picking up? What do you see as missed opportunity for alignment? Who is one or more audience we really should be reaching if we're ever going to get out of the fringes here and into the forefront, and kind of get a collective mandate, if you will, on what our audiences and some alignment points that our collaborative should be focused on. And then we're going to do some hard-hitting target market research, and the kind of stuff that happens a lot in the corporate like marketing world on the far right.
Right.
And it's expensive. There's no way around, like really learning from and testing stuff with audience. It's nuanced. So narrative's always going to be a bit of a guess. You should not try to make it perfect or nothing will ever shift. You need to go out and try bold things. And it's important to do good research. So you're making like an educated guess,
Right.
And we're going to move as quickly as we can from that research phase to the bold action phase. Because also, I know this is a podcast that includes rants. My little quick rant. A lot of narrative research out there is very theoretical and ivory tower and sits on the shelf. We really don't want to do that. We want to do our learning and then go do some big things. I can't tell you what those are yet because the research will say what it is. But types of things that we're considering are partnering with a quite well-known comedian who literally has millions of eyes and ears on him from some of our potential target audiences and doing a few episodes of his next series about inclusive economies issues. Working with some influencer networks, stuff with who gets placed as talking heads on different news things. Whatever we do, we are not going to do like a nonprofit funded billboard. Like we want to do smart things working with people, channels, influencers, content that already have millions of eyes and ears on them in target audiences. And then we want to do learning around what happened. What did we learn? Yeah. We're not going to have perfect data. Narrative change takes a long time and it's hard to measure. So also I could do another rant. Stop asking everyone for so much data. And then we're going to share out our learnings with many, many movement peers and also with funders. So part of the Narrative Collab is a funder learning and action cohort. Our really awesome funding partners who are boldly resourcing this work are going to do some big thinking and hopefully action with us of, based on what we're learning, how does resourcing this kind of work need to happen differently? Because again, we're not trying to always compare ourselves to the right, but there's some fascinating research out there on literally what the capital stack looks like on the far right of how this team sport is being played as a long game.
So the takeaway from sort of all of that is narratives won't change if we do nothing.
Yeah.
They don't just evolve over time. Like the narratives were, I feel this way about finance, right? Like finance is a system that humans made up. We constructed all of these tools.
Yes.
We figured out how they work. It is a constructed system. So are our cultural narratives. They are not natural. They are not the air. They feel like the air that we breathe, but they are that because of steps that people took to shape these narratives, whether those are cultural actors, or whether those are cultural actors or religious actors or political actors, but there's a set of people who are actively shaping the narratives.
Yes, absolutely.
It is work that actually needs to be done.
Yes. And I think for me, a lot of humbling lessons over the past year or so of putting this collaborative together, a lot of it is old-fashioned organizing. Like, yes, there's narrative science to it and target market testing and blah, blah, blah. And there is no replacement for just organizing, in ways that help all of us get on board and shape it.
Yep. Because in the end, even if it is about taking an action, it's not about taking an action alone. And so we have to do things, but back to why you built a collaborative, it actually needs to be collective action. It needs to be coordinated action, good old-fashioned organizing.
Yes. Yep.
I want to spend some time focusing on a word that carries a great deal of weight in the parts of finance that claim to create good in the world. Local. Local capital, local ownership, local solution, locals markets, place-based investing, community wealth building. This word shows up everywhere, or the connotations behind this word show up. And part of its power is that it sounds self-evidently good. in impact investing, development finance, community finance, climate finance, there's a growing assumption that if something is locally grounded, it is probably better. And I understand why that assumption has such power in those fields. The word local carries a powerful promise for finance that wants to be more accountable and more rooted in the realities of people and place. It suggests knowledge, relationship, proximity. It suggests that decisions are being made closer to the people affected by them. But I think we need to slow down, because thinking about local as literally about a place is not what gives this so much meaning. It's that local is a narrative. And narratives do something very specific. They're not slogans, they're not value statements, they're not communication strategies. A narrative is a shared story about how the world works. Narratives tell us who has authority, whose knowledge matters, what feels normal, and what becomes imaginable. In finance, they quietly determine, or sometimes loudly determine, what kinds of solutions we can even see. So when we hear the word local in the context of innovative finance, the most important question is not, what place are we talking about? The most important question is, what story about change is being told? Because there's not one narrative of local, there are several, and each one carries a different theory of how finance should create change. So the first one is that local as kind of a democratic legitimacy. This is something simple. The people most affected by decisions should have a meaningful role in making them. This narrative is fundamentally about authority. It asks, who gets to define the problem and who gets to decide what success looks like and who shapes the flow of capital? Under this narrative, local is not primarily geographic, it's political. It's about authorship. The promise that people closest to the consequences of financial decisions should have influence over those decisions. But there's an important difference between telling that story and living that story. Because this narrative only becomes real, it's not just a fairy tale, when the practices change. If local means democratic legitimacy, then governance has to change. Communities can't merely be consulted in some charrette process or invited into various listening sessions where what they say is promptly dismissed. Maybe not always, but pretty often. They need real authority. Authority to set priorities, approve, reject, redefine success. The practice that makes this narrative real is governance. Without a shift in governance, local becomes a description rather than a transformation. So the second way local shows up as a narrative is about a stewardship of place. This narrative says that place matters, not simply the people in them, but the land, the water, infrastructure, housing, ecosystems, community institutions that cannot simply be picked up and moved somewhere else. There's a permanence to this narrative. The underlying story is that the place is not just a market, it's something being entrusted to us, something inherited, sustained, and passed forward. The narrative shifts the question. Instead of asking, what can finance fund? It asks, what must this community steward? And again, the narrative only becomes real through practice. The practice that makes this narrative real is asset stewardship, asking which assets are essential to the future of this place, who controls them, who benefits from them, and how are they protected from extraction over time. A place-based narrative is not made real because capital arrives in a geography. It's made real when finance strengthens a community's relationship to the assets that shape its future. So the third is seeing local as contextual intelligence. And this one might be the most important. It's certainly the one that we engage with the most. This narrative asserts that context is a form of expertise. History, culture, relationships, trust, local knowledge are not soft add-ons to a financial analysis. They are part of what determines whether or not the finance will work at all and how to make sure that the finance works for more people. This narrative challenges one of the deepest assumptions in finance, that financial expertise is portable, that what works in one place should work everywhere. A vehicle is a vehicle is a vehicle, and it moves capital in the same way no matter where it lands. Instead, this narrative argues that people inside a system understand dimensions of risk, opportunity, resilience, and value that financial models cannot see. The result of financial standardization is that we assume that what works in one place should work everywhere. But the assertion of the importance of contextual knowledge is putting forth that people inside of a system, people who have lived experience, understand dimensions of risk, opportunity, resilience, and value in ways that financial models, financial analysts cannot see. But this narrative, again, becomes only real through very specific practice. Practice is about letting context change the model, not simply inform it. Can local knowledge alter assumptions about risk, governance, return expectations, timelines, measures of success? Because if context can only be observed, but not in the end influence decisions, then context has not become a powerful form of expertise. It is simply research. The narrative only becomes real when capital adapts to context, informed by the lived experience of those in that community, rather than requiring context to adapt to capital. The fourth narrative is about economic self-determination at a local level. And this fourth narrative really focuses on economics. The story's pretty straightforward. Communities should benefit from the value they create. Many economies experience a familiar pattern. Value is generated locally, but ownership, decision-making, and profit accumulate somewhere else. This narrative of local as economic self-determination challenges that pattern. It asks, who captures value? Who owns productive assets? Who controls capital? Who benefits when economic activity succeeds? But once again, the narrative is not enough. The corresponding practice is examining value capture, not merely where capital originates, but where benefits accumulate. Capital can be local and still be exclusionary. Local institutions can still reinforce concentrated ownership. Local markets can still reproduce inequality. The discipline is asking who ultimately benefits. Because a self-determination narrative is only real when value is broadly shared rather than narrowly captured. Finally, seeing local as alternative knowledge. This narrative sits underneath, in many ways, all the others. It's a kind of undergirding resonance. It is the narrative that says communities possess forms of knowledge that finance does not yet know how to see. Knowledge about care, about resilience, about vulnerability, well-being, and the conditions that make systems function for all. It suggests that expertise is distributed, and the corresponding practice here is perhaps the hardest of all. Local knowledge has to be capable of changing decisions, not just informing them, validating them, or decorating them after the fact. If a community shares knowledge and nothing about the structure changes, then finance has extracted insight without sharing power. The test is whether local knowledge can alter assumptions, reshape priorities, and redefine value itself. What strikes me is that in the parts of finance that are trying to produce social, environmental, or public good, these narratives are all competing to define what local means. Local as democratic legitimacy, local as stewardship, local as contextual intelligence, local as economic self-determination, local as truly alternative knowledge. Each one expands a different possibility, makes different actors visible, and privileges different forms of expertise. Which is why I think the real question is no longer, is this finance local? That question's too easy. We can point to a postal code or a zip code to make that make sense. The better question is, what narrative of local is being invoked and what practices make that narrative real? Narratives matter. They shape what we believe is normal, what we believe is possible. For decades, the dominant narrative in finance suggested that communities should become investment ready. They should perform for finance and show that they are worthy. But the emerging narrative is something else. It's that capital must become context ready. And if that's the story we're beginning to tell, then the real work is not changing the language of finance. It's challenging the governance, assumptions, ownership structures, and forms of expertise that finance recognizes. And that's where a narrative becomes a practice, and that's where systems begin to change.
At Criterion Institute, our partners understand that shifting deeply entrenched power dynamics can't be done with a single training session or report. Our most successful engagements have spanned years, not months, and involve close collaboration within one of our 6 systems change approaches. We're currently in the midst of advancing some remarkable change around how power is seen and addressed in our financial systems. We hope our work sparks your thinking about what might be possible together, and we invite you to have a further conversation about how the change we are creating today aligns with your impact goals.
To learn more about our work, visit us at criterioninstitute.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Your reviews help our podcast reach a wider audience. Thanks for listening.